Thank you, everyone, for being here. I really do appreciate it. And I do appreciate the opportunity to be here at CinCon again. It's definitely one of my favorite conferences to attend, along with our good friends at GovWare. Anyway, let's start things off. So I've been in security now for, well, quite literally 31 years now at this point. And it has been quite a journey. So I've learned a lot of lessons along the way, and it's really amazing to be able to have opportunities to speak with folks and share some of those stories, those lessons learned, and share little things in sidebars. Like, for example, I'm now a part owner of a whiskey distillery as well as a soccer club in Canada. But yeah, keeps things interesting. Right. I work at 1Password. I also have on the advisory board for Sightline Security, which is a nonprofit that does work for other nonprofits and providing them cybersecurity services. I'm also on the board for bios.io and gnostic.ai. So I don't sleep a lot. Now, one of the things I like to talk about initially is with 1Password, one of the things that is I always like to clear up right away is that we have been in business now for about 20 years as a company. I've only been there a year myself. But anytime I talk to CISOs in the industry, they'll say, oh, yeah, I use 1Password on my local device. And I say, OK, do you use it in your enterprise? And they're like, well, no. They didn't realize there was enterprise offerings. So as we have gone through the years, we've scaled up. And in the last year, we've acquired 4 different companies. And we've done basically changed into an enterprise player. And I just wanted to share that because I just wanted to dispel the myth that we were still just a password manager. But one thing I can't dispel is I am Canadian. And yes, it is contagious. We do have a habit of saying sorry. And when we do hacking in Canada, it's a little bit different than you might imagine, but it keeps things interesting. Now, years ago, I was working for Wendy Nather. If you don't know her, definitely somebody to look up. She is an absolute luminary within the industry, and she would kick me if she heard me say that. So when I was working for her, she sent me this picture. And I use this story over and over again when I do presentations because it really makes a point. She sent me this picture, and she said, tell me where I am. And I said, boss, I got work to do. She goes, yeah, you're working for me. Tell me where I am. I was like, all right. So I knew that she had been speaking at a conference in Europe. I knew what her favorite airline was from social media. The key here was I couldn't use anything internal from work. I had to use information that I could only get in the public forum, or public domain, rather. So I said, is this your flight? And she said, well, yes, it is. Now, tell me where I'm sitting. It's like, what? So I grumped and groaned, went and got a coffee, came back, and I said, all right, I'm going to pull the flight manifest from a site called seatguru.com so you can see all the seating arrangements. And I knew her flight. I knew it was Delta Airlines. I knew where she was going. So I figured, okay, based on where the tip of the wing was in the picture, which was parsed off in that particular slide, I took an educated guess. And I said, quite literally, it must be seat 5A. And she said, well, actually, it's seat 6A. I was so close. But the really interesting thing here is how much time it took me to figure out where she was sitting and on which flight she was on. Can anybody take a guess, and there's no wrong answers, anybody can take a guess how long it took me, including my complaining and going to get a coffee, to find out where she was sitting on the plane? Any guesses? 30 minutes. Okay, we got 30. Anyone else? What was that? 10. You were the closest. It took just under 5 minutes for this all to happen, and that included me going upstairs and getting a coffee from the kitchen. This is just really to highlight how easy it is for an attacker to gain information about your environment in a very, very short order. None of the information that I used was stuff that I was privy to. It was just strictly externals. And this really does bring me to the point where I am constantly feeling like I am, losing my mind because a lot of the conversations that we have are ones that we've had over and over again for years. But it does give me the ability to, rant and rave at conferences and have, talks like this. Now, the really interesting thing is when we're talking about things like access control and things like that, we have to understand the underlying problems that we have to fix in order to make sure that we're protecting identities and things like that. NotPetya was a great example of a compromise that was done, a cyber attack that was seen as ransomware. It turned out it was be much more insidious than that. And the data breaches that have come along in that same sort of vein, we have WannaCry. WannaCry was an exploit that was done using a vulnerability that we had all known for over a decade. That's really kind of inexcusable at this point in the game. Then we had SolarWinds, we had Colonial Pipeline, we had Marriott multiple times, and this is not to beat up on any of them. This is quite literally because attacks can happen to anyone. And we have to be very cognizant of that. And we have to stop saying that it was an unpredictable thing that nobody could have figured out. And this really does lend itself to conversation about black swan events, but that's another talk for another time. But the thing here is, large impact events. There's some seats up here at the front, gents, if you want to come sit up here. Come on up. Large impactful events that were really damaging that in hindsight were very easily fixed. Like having a vulnerability that was known for a decade. Oh, but nothing could ever happen to that. But the problem is we really have to understand that this is really a state of cybersecurity in this point in time. We have to accept that it's all on fire, and that's not to give up hope. That is really about we have to refocus. We have to redouble our efforts because things like this continually haunt us. And this being a representative of a password. Now, when you leave your house or you leave your flat, wherever it happens to be, and go off to work in the day or whatever it happens to be, you lock your door so that your stuff is safe. There's some seats up here if you'd like. Don't worry, I don't bite. Now, in this particular case, you lock your house and you leave. It doesn't know any better as to who's coming and going. So if you lose your key along the way and somebody of a negative bent finds that key and knows somehow that's associated with you, they can get into your house and your house can't stop that. So we have to find a way to do better access control. And we have to understand that passwords really are a very limited factor. They're not a security control, they are a control, full stop. And we have to also understand that it's big business. This here is from a story where 4 individuals were arrested for compromising websites and reusing passwords. This was literally 4 people that had generated over $71 million in revenue for themselves just marketing stolen passwords. We have to look at things differently. Now, back in the day when I was working for a power company, we had this really interesting ARP storm that was happening in our network. We couldn't for the life of us figure out what was going on. And we said, okay, this is crazy. We went through all the logs, we went through all the connections. We couldn't figure out what was causing this. Finally, I just said, well, Occam's razor, I got to figure out the simplest answer. I went out into the data center with the raised floor and I got the tile lifter and I pulled pulled a panel up, nothing. Pulled the next panel up, and this was all in front of our networking rack. Third panel I picked up, can anybody guess what was looking back at me under there? And no, it wasn't a rat. Any guesses? All right, I'll let you off the hook. It was a Cisco router that nobody knew was there. So the company I was working for was originally part of a much larger company that had been bifurcated into 5 separate companies. This was a direct connection to another company, which I ended up working for later, no connection there. That was a direct connect between the 2 organizations that they didn't know about and we didn't know about. So if there had been a malware incident in our environment that had spread, it would have taken them out as well, quite possibly. And this is the kind of thing we have to look at when we're protecting our environments. We have to look for these gotchas, these moments of nonsense. And we also have to change our mentality of how we approach things. Security practitioners for a very long time like to approach it as we're the flaming sword of justice. The answer is no. Sorry, you didn't hear that? Yeah, the answer is still no. That does nothing to improve security in an environment, and it also really doesn't help with the culture that you're dealing with in making sure that you have a secure environment. If you're telling people no all the time, it's like if I told my kids no all the time, they know they would just route around me and go to mom. So when we're talking about SSO, we have to understand it's not a panacea, and we have to understand that shadow IT can and will happen. Just over a year ago, I gave a talk in Toronto, Canada, and I said, how many people in here have security controls and policies to protect against shadow ID? Every hand went up. I was like, okay, cool. How many of you have shadow IT? Everybody chuckled, looked uncomfortably, and then every hand went back up. This is one of those things that is a recurring problem, and it's not specific to any one industry vertical. Everybody has this. And shadow IT, we have to be very clear, is not out of malice. This is people trying to get their jobs done, trying to get done as quickly as possible because we're constantly told we have to innovate, and we're not necessarily given the environment to innovate within. So we also have to look at how we're going to better deal with a stronger access control regimen, and we have to account for the rise of agentic AI. Now, if you were not paying attention, or if you were paying attention about 6 months ago, nobody was really talking about this. But suddenly this has been thrust into the forefront and everybody's talking about this. But This is part and parcel of the access control issue because you now have agents that are operating on behalf of people doing tasks that, albeit simple tasks, but security hasn't necessarily been factored into the mix. And when you look at all of these different type of applications you have to contend with, you have to understand that the stakes are rising. So why is SSO fail-safe? It simplifies things for us. It makes it convenient, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's protecting everything. I'm just waiting for you to get your picture there. There we go. And we have to understand that data breaches are going to continue to happen. This is one of those things that is absolutely frustrating to me. So back in 2012, I was tracking data breaches on my own personal website, and apparently I needed a hobby, so I was doing that. And at the time, the biggest data breach that was recorded was about 6.9 million records. Big news in 2012. People wouldn't even look at it sideways today. If you look at a site called informationisbeautiful.net, I love this site. They do all sorts of amazing data representations. They've actually had to re-architect how they present the data at least 3 times because it wouldn't fit on the screen. So we have like Indonesian SIM cards, Facebook, all sorts of data breaches that have been of massive, massive impact. We're dealing with data breaches with orders of magnitude of over 1 billion records on a pretty regular basis now. Now, SSO falls down because it's incomplete. I have never found an organization that had everything behind SSO because there is an SSO tax they have to apply to that. They are, in order to get their applications behind it, they have to pay for the premium version or whatever it happens to be, which is unfortunate. And a lot of times it's weak policy enforcement because it hasn't been designed properly, or sorry, configured properly, my bad, because organizations will just put it in and back in Canada, we call it the Ron Popeil method of set it and forget it and just hope for the best. And it has very poor visibility. It doesn't give you a comprehensive look. Now, SSO, in particular with our company, we had to deal with this data breach back in 2023 that didn't affect us directly, but it was with a vendor that was providing services that this was really unfortunate. The attackers were able to gain access into the vendor's environment and cause all sorts of different troubles there. Now, the attack vector is they came in through login credentials in the vendor support area, and they were able to gain access to this. And this vendor was providing SSO services. You know what I'm talking about. Yes, shush. They were providing SSO services for many companies. And unfortunately, this had a precipitous impact on vendors across, or companies across the board. And we, along with many others, had to put out notices of if it hadn't actually impacted us. Thankfully, it didn't, and that was a lovely thing. But luck is not a strategy when you're doing cybersecurity. Key takeaways here is understanding what the risks are with federated identities, session token security, and timely disclosure. One of the things that absolutely frustrates me, and I see this time and again in our industry, is a company will suffer a data breach, but they'll try to hide the baby. They just like, no, that didn't happen. Don't look over here. Oh, look at that over there, pretty bird. And this does nothing to improve things, and it doesn't build trust in your stakeholders, customers, the public at large. We have to do a better job. Now, when we're looking at SSO, we have that initial state. We have your laptop, you're trying to connect to, say, AWS, username, MFA, great. Then we look at adding in something like VPN. Sure, that's a little bit better, the zero trust model. We have to understand here that a lot of SaaS offerings don't actually offer support for basic blocking on IP addresses, CIDR rules as well. And the implementation of IP address connections and the latency that's added into your network connections is something to factor in. Now, this is one of those things where when I was doing work for a defense contractor in the United States, Lord knows why they let me in the door. This is one of those problems where we were doing configuration issues and trying to block out various IP blocks. I ended up having to put in bogon lists on edge routers for the US Navy just to block out all sorts of different parts of the world. And it was really amazing because once other parts of the US military infrastructure found out about this, they were like, what's a bogon list? I'm like, okay, we have to do a better job of securing our environments. So when we're looking at legacy versions here, we have the MDM effect of SSO to be able to get access, tripping over my tongue, gain access into your SaaS-based environments, and understanding that it is assuming that SSO is protecting every application is a bit of a misnomer. It is protecting certain ones, absolutely, but we want to have a better job of this. We want to have a much more broad coverage to make sure that our environments are not inadvertently exposed. And then we look at the modern SSO model with IDP. Your endpoint is authenticated with MDM. You go through SSO, access there, and then understanding that you're assuming it looks like I just repeated those slides, so I'll just keep going. And then we have the double SSO sandwich. Let's go through it. SSO, VPN, SSO again to be able to gain access to your application. You see how this gets really complicated really fast. And security should be seamless. We should be able to provide security for our customers, for our environment, for our stakeholders in a way that just makes sense. We don't need to make it more difficult. We don't need to add complexity while diminishing the value for our environments. We also have to consider the people, the devices. There's so much cruft out there. We've had to deal with IPv4 for many, many years, and now IPv6, and I really hope we don't manage to exhaust that one. But who knows, with all the agentic AI agents going out there, what if they had IP addresses too? Anyway, I will pretend I didn't say that. So the typical enterprise has about 96 different business apps that they use with IDP, and 52% of those don't even support SAML, so it makes it very difficult to do a lot of integration. This is a little bit frustrating. I know other environments that are literally upwards of about 500 different applications they're using just to get business done. So the assumption being here that a lot of these authentications that are happening through IDP and SSO are secure, but realistically, it's not the case. You can block the attacker, you can let in the charming, handsome gentleman there, or you look at how we're not covering everything. We understand that there's also service accounts, SSH keys, API keys. Not all of that is going through SSO, nor should it, but there has to be a better way to secure our environment. And we have to understand that compromised systems with corporate logins, it just spirals from there. And you overlay something like agentic AI, you really do run the risk of complicating matters even further. Now, 46% of, this is from the Verizon DBI report this year, 46% of these compromised systems had corporate logins on them. And these are systems that had been breached. And we have to understand that BYOD programs are a real big piece of this. I just can't believe we're still having the same conversation. It's been at least a decade since BYOD was the buzz term of the flavor of the month. I guess it's the flavor of the decade. But a lot of organizations need this in order to function because they don't want to maintain a fleet of laptops, a fleet of desktops just to get things done. They want to push it off to the end user and let them use their own devices. But if we're using something that is a better approach to better secure those end users, we're not necessarily introducing risk into the environment if we're taking that proactive step. And as I mentioned about shadow IT, we have to understand what it is. Now, I was talking about that earlier. It is, people just trying to get their jobs done. But a lot of times when this happens, it introduces risk into the environment. We are rolling these things out. They're trying to get things done, but they connect them to back-end production systems. They use production data because it's easy, it's accessible. But then it leads to problems, and the attackers know this. This here is a graphical representation of ransomware attacks over the last few years up until 2023, because that was the most current data I was able to pull. The bigger the circle meant the larger the impact for that, or the larger the environment that was hit. And as you can see, there was a bit of a gap here because corporations figured out how to better protect their environments. But then the attackers pivoted. We had the pandemic. All of a sudden, everybody was remote. The attackers changed their way of doing things. I had several emails in my inbox that said, oh, if you don't click on this link, you're going to lose your healthcare coverage. I'm like, I'm in Canada. We don't actually lose anything there. But as you progress, you'll see the bubbles are getting smaller. The reason here is the attackers have pivoted away from going after major enterprises and going after SMBs and mid-market. The reason being is because most of these companies have contracts with larger organizations. They become a very easy pivot point for them to get into larger organizations. And these smaller shops, generally speaking, aren't as well protected by any stretch of the imagination. So, reasons why shadow IT happens. Speed and convenience. Perceived inadequacy. This is and when I say this one, this is a lot of times you'll see projects within an environment, they'll have spinning things up because they go, okay, wait a minute, IT can't help me with this. They don't have the ability to support this because this is a new cutting edge widget or grapple grommet, whatever it happens to be. And the other piece is, as I mentioned before, innovation and experimentation. I have had so many CIOs and CISOs in the past say, oh, we have to innovate, we have to this, we have to that. But they give you no ability to do it, so you're ostensibly building an airplane that is already in flight. And this introduces risks, like the risk to data security. If you're using production data and you're exposing this application to the internet, because that never happens, this is a real problem. And further risks, the risk of loss of that data, the risk of compliance issues. If you are using data that is production data that might have EHR, like electronic health records or something like that, if that's compromised and exposed to the internet, this is a rather significant problem in of itself. And there could be fines associated with that. The risk to the bottom line. If your code for your environment, if your data, whatever the crown jewels happen to be, get exposed to the internet, this could be a real problem and it could have a financial impact. There was this is quite a few years ago now, there was a travel site in Europe that if you booked your ticket, you could see the URL, and the URL there, at the end of it, there was a unique identifier. It'd be like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you change the last digit, you saw somebody else's plane ticket. Change it again, someone else's ticket. That company in 24 hours was out of business. That was really a life-ending moment for that particular organization. Now, if they had better access control methods in place, if they have better ways to protect it, maybe that could have helped. Also, web application testing would have been a nice choice. But all sorts of these things that happen have a huge impact to the environment, and we have to understand when these things happen. How many people here have ever been in a production environment and they saw a beige desktop sitting there that was running mission-critical code written by a summer student, and nobody knew how to move it off? And I see laughing, so I know there's a few of you in here. These are the kind of things we have to understand, that yes, we are moving to cloud environments, but by and large, most enterprises are only about 50% cloud first. A lot of them are in hybrid states. A lot of them have sunk costs that they've invested in their data centers, and we're still dealing with these sort of issues. And these issues have their own complications, especially when you have something like this particular story. Now, I was working at a power company, and there was this one server that was acting up, and it was yet another ARP storm. And we went out there and we said, okay, what is going on? We couldn't find any proper documentation as to who was responsible for the system. We had a system of record that's supposed to tell where everybody, what the call tree is, all the rest of it. This particular server had none of that. Eventually, it got to the point where nobody was answering. We couldn't figure out who it was, so I just did what a less than rational person would do. I pulled the Ethernet cable. And then I wrote a note, and I put it in an envelope, and I tied it to the back of the server, and I left it there. Sure enough, the owner of that system came down, mad as absolutely furious, red in the face, spit and fire, said, this system is mission critical. We absolutely have to have that on. And I'm like, hey, Nick, how are you? Come with me. We walked out onto the floor. I said, is this your server here in the rack? This one? And he goes, yep, this is for you. And I pulled the note off the Ethernet cable and I handed it off to him. He goes, what is this? Opens it up. He reads it and goes, color returning to his face. He goes, thank you for your time. And he left. Can anybody guess why he calmed down on the spot? That note was dated 9 months earlier. It took him 9 months to realize that this mission-critical application was offline. This is the kind of problem that I worry about when we're trying to protect environments, and you're trying to worry about things like, SSO is only protecting part of the puzzle, but when you have stuff like this, where you have systems that people aren't even paying attention to, think about how much damage an attacker could have done if they had access to this system and be able to cause trouble. It wouldn't have been seen. Then we also have to look at the way people behave in their environments. People are not protocols. They're not going to do what you expect them to do. They're going to do new and exciting, really fun stuff, like selecting very bad passwords. And you know what? That's not their fault. That's ours as security practitioners. We have to give them better solutions to protect themselves, because the vast majority of people are dealing with passwords that are like my dog's name 123 or my birthday or my kid's. Any of that, that's on us. As security practitioners, that's where we've fallen down, because they didn't get the message. So we have to figure out a better way to do things, because people will always find ways to rationalize risk. They go, oh, what a lovely cookie. I want that cookie. The cookie's wrapped in barbed wire. Yeah, okay, I'll figure it out. This is the kind of logic and thought process that will put to any sort of IT-related issue, because most people, security is not front of mind for them. We have to also worry about production data on laptops even today. When we have environments that are cloud first, they still have people downloading stuff onto their systems that should not be there. They have them installing applications that should not be there. And we have to learn lessons from these particular data breaches, because if we don't, we are going to continually repeat them. And if you ever want a moment of zen, go look at XKCD, their whole comic strip setup. It's just, they have so much good material there. So, analyzing notable data breaches is an essential thing. We have to go through and figure out what the lessons are that we can take away from that, because far too often we'll just read it in the news and go, oh, geez, that's terrible. That'll never happen to me. But did you take a time to look at the root cause, or was the root cause even shared? And the root cause is never just one thing. It's usually a comedy of errors that led to that. And we've seen that time and again. Capital One back in 2019, and again, not to beat them up, but this is what happened with them. They had a shadow IT instance where a misconfigured WAF exposed 100 million credit cards. Uber, 2016, 56 million users and drivers, or well, actual drivers, not drivers. Anyway, were compromised because their GitHub repository was accessible. It was not behind SSO. Dow Jones, 2017, a exposed S3 bucket. Now, S3 buckets, I swear, this is one of the simplest, most basic example, but far too often you see organizations spinning up S3 buckets and putting sensitive data into it. And when you create one of these S3 buckets, it says on the interface in bold print, do not make this public unless you absolutely know what you're doing. And then for a period there, a few years ago, it was every data breach was tied back to an S3 bucket. It was absolutely staggering. We have to look at better ways to improve the protection of the data, and that really boils down to how do we protect the individual and the identities within our environment, because honestly, that is the front line of security. Any security program boils down to the human element. When we're looking at the future of cybersecurity, we have to look at things like a zero trust architecture. You can like it or love that term. The whole point of this is about risk reduction. That is the fundamental piece about zero trust. I've seen people that say, oh, it's this, it's that, it's to do with warfighters. No, no, no. It is risk reduction, full stop. And you want to make sure that you're looking at a way to improve your organization by reducing those, moving away from static passwords is a great example. Continuous authentication verification, microsegmentation, extended access management, not just SSO. Extended access management being the software that can go beyond that. Sorry, I felt like somebody was coming through the wall there. To make sure that you're not missing those various accounts that expose potential risk to the organization. And the rise of cyber insurance is another one that always vexes me, because I've seen a lot of companies that think of this as their get out of jail free card. It has to be clear that cyber insurance will not make you whole. It will take care of the investigation. It'll take care of the litigation at the beginning. And sorry, camera guy. And it will not make you whole. It will not restore you back to your first position. You want to make sure that you understand that. And when you're looking at ways to protect your environment, you have to look at the what ifs. And a great example of that is the 10th person principle. Now, this was first created by the IDF during the Yom Kippur War, where they all were convinced that their adversary wouldn't attack them. And their adversary attacked them in a way that they had not expected. And this is one of those things where if you're protecting your environment and you have 9 people saying nobody can ever hack into our environment, you have to have the job of that 10th person to say, well, they could, and here's how. Because you don't want to have everyone in lockstep saying the same thing, because you could be missing something that could have been easily remedied. And that takes us to agentic AI. Now, the difference between agentic AI and Gen AI is really quite simple. Generative AI is about creating content, videos, text, whatever it happens to be. Excuse me. Agentic AI is something where it is actually making autonomous decisions on your behalf. It's taking care of work that, honestly, we just called it scripting back when I was a young lad, but here we have it with a new fancy name. But one of the problems that I have here is that security isn't necessarily factored into the equation. So some of the key features of agentic AI is it has the autonomy to operate on your behalf. It has adaptability. It can change depending on what the tasks are that's put to it. And goal orientation. It has strict set of rules that it's supposed to operate within. And it's going to make these decisions based on the inputs it receives. Now, for agentic AI to be effective, it has to have limited subset. You don't want to get it to do too many things, because then we go back to the early 2000s with agents on our desktops, running at 80% CPU utilization, and that's not going to do anybody any favors. We have to make sure that we're looking at the security aspect and not accepting it at face value. And when I talk about that, there was a story here in one company I was working at where we had what I refer to as the KVM fallacy. This was a room in our office that you had to go in order to gain access to any production systems, in order to do any changes, things like that. Sadly, the one I worked in had no windows. It was cinder block walls. It was quite awful. And I remember one day I got really fed up and I was like, I'm done with this. I went back to my office and I sat there and I was looking outside. And I was like, what if I can just access those systems from here? I knew the IP addresses. I was like, fired up remote desktop, connect straight through. And I was like, wait a second. This room that is dedicated access to all the production systems was a lie. It was quite literally, don't look behind the curtain, the Great Oz commands it. I could access, it was a flat network. So the security controls that were in place were pure fiction. And this is the kind of thing we have to make sure that's not happening when we look at technologies like agentic AI. Agentic AI, from a productivity perspective, from an ease of use perspective, it's going to improve matters, no doubt. But we have to make sure that security is not left behind. And it provides broader risk footprint here, because when we're looking at APIs and things like that, if something is to go wrong, if an attacker is able to compromise one of the agents, there is the potential knock-on effect for very, very damaging issues that can arise. We have to look at security principles and making sure that we're applying zero trust and make sure there's proper segmentation so that these agents, while they are running, they're operating on your behalf, can't be compromised, can't be utilized. I was at RSA a few weeks ago, and I was part of a round table with the 3 black hat hackers and a few others. And it was really interesting to see their perspective. And we're talking about agentic AI. And I said, have any of you tried compromising this? And they were like, oh, I actually hadn't thought about that. And I said, well, yes, because these agents will have credentials embedded in them in order to access other pieces. And they have basically full range of motion within the environment. And they're like, oh, I'm adding that to my repertoire. And I was like, oh, God, what have I done? Security is something that is, unfortunately, the after effect. When the internet was born, God, I was around for that, it was point A to point B. And security was never part of the equation. I was very fortunate that in my postgrad work, I had Scott Bradner as one of my professors. And if you look back to the early RFCs that defined what the internet was, his name's all over them. So I really count myself lucky there. And asked the question, I said, was security ever factored in? And he said, flat out, no, not in the slightest. It was never even a consideration. This is what I worry about when we're talking about agentic AI. We see really cool things that are popping out, like Anthropic's MCP. Google's got their A2A. There are efforts that are happening, but in a lot of ways, it's after the horse has already left the barn. We're having this conversation after, when it should have been up front. So some of the examples of risk that agents have is, attacker steals the credentials. They have the latitude to move within the environment because the agents would most likely be unrestricted in their ability to do their job because you don't want to introduce latency into the organization. And without traditional software, agents that run without human intervention, if something goes wrong, it could have a very significant impact. And when we're looking at these sort of things, we have to understand that these impacts can be absolutely staggering. How many people here remember the Mirai botnet? Oh, y'all have homework. So, quite a few years ago, there was a Mirai botnet, and the reason this thing was successful is because it utilized internet-facing devices that were using default credentials that were hard-coded into the devices, like support, root 54321, admin. There's no excuse for that at all. If you have any device that's attaching to the internet, programmatically it should change the default credentials at first login, full stop, end of discussion. But Dave, Mirai was so long ago. Was it? So, I found this article just a few months ago. The Mirai botnet behind the largest DDoS attack to date. January 22nd, 2025. This is still a going concern. As of last week, the biggest DDoS attack was over 6 terabytes of traffic. This is not getting better anytime soon. Agentic AI agents can generate realistic and targeted phishing attacks. They can do identity verification, voice, face, behavioral analytics, all sorts of different ways that they can be utilized. They can even generate content and build out deep fakes, depending on how they're implemented. So from a summary perspective, we have to figure out how do we do secure management of credentials. That's a very key piece of the puzzle. AI identity governance. This is something we have to take into account. AI-friendly zero trust networks, because a lot of these AI implementations, and I talk to a lot of AI companies, I'm on the board of one, we have to make sure that we're having these conversations as early as possible, because the impact that can happen is going to be very significant. Audit and explainability. Can you say why your AI system did X, and can you explain it? Can you show verifiably what happened and why? Supply chain security. This has been a favorite of mine since I gave my first talk years ago. Now with AI, this could get really interesting. You got people going after compromising model zoos, all sorts of different things, data poisoning. There are so many different ways to mess with AI systems. And compliance alignment, making sure that you're developing clear compliance strategies to protect your AI systems. Now, one of the things that we like to talk about at 1Password is the access trust gap. You have the internal systems to make sure that everything is working at work, but then you have people that are using their unmanaged applications, their BYOD devices, that have a direct impact to the safety and security of the environment, and we have to make sure that we are able to protect all of those devices. SSO will only go so far. When we're looking at how do we do a better job of protecting it, we have to start with the crawl, walk, run. Crawl, be able to audit your systems. Do you understand what is actually being protected? Walk, visibility and conditional access, making sure that you have a clear outline as to what those systems are doing and be able to actually prove it. And then run, passwordless, real-time risk engine, all sorts of different ways like this. There are better ways to do security, and one of those is extended access management. This is about enhancing security, taking care of regulatory compliance, data protection, operational efficiencies, and audit and monitoring. With AI systems, audit and monitoring is going to become a very big piece of the puzzle, and we can't forget that, especially if we get ahead of our skis, because bad things can and will continue to happen. Now, this was a company I worked at many, many years ago as a high-tech manufacturer, and within the first 2 weeks, I was asked to do an audit of all the root user or super user accounts within the environment. We did that. We went through, and my teammate and I, we did a complete audit of all 14,000 people that were working at the company and all the associated credentials, which was way more than that. And we found that there were 10 accounts that had root access that belonged to people that were no longer in the environment. They had left the company for various different reasons, but these accounts were still active. One of these accounts, and I use this story very, very many times because I love it, one of these accounts had been active in the last 2 years. Can anybody guess what the problem was with this particular account that was being accessed that belonged to somebody who was no longer at the company? Any guesses? Sorry, what was that? That's a good one, but no, it was actually a human touching keyboard. This belonged to somebody who had been dead for 5 years. This account should never have been active. The person who was using it didn't even know who that credentials belonged to. They were using it to just go and check a script to make sure it was running. So they had actually had this on a piece of paper stuck to their keyboard, and they were, I know it's a cliche, but they actually really did, I saw it. And they were using this, and this is one of those absolute frustrations, is like, no matter how many times you teach people on how to do better security, there's always somebody that hasn't had that education yet, hasn't had that conversation. That's why security has to be ever vigilant and making sure that we're going that extra mile to provide that to all of the people in our environment, because every time you train up your people in your environment, new hires come in. So yes, that person had been dead for 5 years. Now the takeaways here is like shadow IT isn't going away. No matter how secure you think your environment is, it's still there. People will always will always prioritize convenience. If they can get away with Fluffy Bunny 123 as their password, I guarantee they will do it. But making a password that's 19 miles long and full of all the special characters isn't going to help matters either. This is why we need better ways to protect the environment. And there are many. Passwords are such a yesterday kind of thing. Control, visibility, context, and adaptability. We want to be able to make sure that we are changing with the times. And as AI becomes more prominent, we have to make sure that we're adapting accordingly. You want to have an inventory of everything that you don't see, making sure that you're empowering users to understand how they have their secure defaults and actually get them to ask questions. Be curious. And architect your systems for the way people actually work. Don't give them tools written by engineers for engineers, because guess what? Bob in finance is not going to care. So when we talked earlier about the airplane story, that was one of those things that absolutely frustrated me. And now, years later, my old boss, Wendy, now works for me. Yeah. Although it's not quite as wonderful as all that, and I mean that in the funniest way. This is a picture that she sent me a couple weeks ago and said, tell me where I am. And it's like, oh, here we go again. So no matter how many times you think you've tackled the challenges will come back. And you have to be prepared, you have to be adaptable, and making sure you're going that extra mile and understand that things like SSO have only limited utility, and we can do better. That being said, I really like to thank everyone for being here today. I do appreciate the ability to be back in Singapore. I love it here. And if you are bored out of your mind, no, this is not going to take you to a Rickroll. This is actually my podcast, Chasing Entropy, which is on the go now, so I'll let that up there. And thank you very much. If you have any questions, I have exactly 3 minutes.